Hello, everyone. Welcome to the RV show. My name is Vinay.
And my name is Rohan. Our sole story today is about these shocking riots at the US Capitol. Hundreds of people swarmed the Capitol protesting the government's confirmation of the election on January 6th. The diverse mob included citizens with mainstream careers, people like police officers, flower shop owners, a state lawmaker, military veterans, even Olympic medalists, as well as Americans on the fringe. Legislators were forced to pack into their respective chambers, scared for their lives, calling their families. Some of the rioters were armed with guns and bombs as they simply waltzed into the Capitol. It has been denounced as an assault on our democracy, specifically incited by President Trump's statements. There will be a police investigation of what went on at the Capitol to determine why it was so easy for protesters to bypass police security and break into one of the most important buildings in the nation. And looking at the ramifications, we see that right wing social media sites are encountering a lot of attack, and President Trump has been impeached by the House for the second time during his term, which has never happened before. There are now reports of riots around all 50 capitals in the US, including riots at Biden's inauguration coming up soon. So, Vinay, let's start off by just talking about why it was so easy for these people to get into the Capitol. How do you feel that racist roots played into this riot? And do you feel that the police reaction would have been vastly different if they were protesting BLM?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a question that the police actions would have been different if it was a protest against BLM. I think we remember so many Black Lives Matters protests, even the peaceful ones, where they stand and put like they'd sit on their knee, kneel on their knee, and then police would start shooting rubber pellets at them. Whereas over here, we saw pictures on news telecast of people literally breaking windows of the Capitol building. And then there's just police officers nicely helping them downstairs after that. So I feel like there's a big difference in the police actions in the Black Lives Matters protest compared to the U.S. Capitol.
Right. I definitely agree with that. I would say it definitely was driven by the fact that they were right wing and it was a white mob trying to go and protest the election. Obviously, you talked about this, but we saw them taking selfies with the cops, and some of them were even holding hands with the police officers, and it just made no sense because what we saw back in like June and March when the BLM protests were at its height, what we saw was that these protesters were being forcefully attacked by police officers and weren't even able to simply do peaceful protests. Um, and obviously the reactions have just been vastly different, and it shouldn't be like that.
I think during the Black Lives Matters protests, Trump was actually tweeting at that time saying that protests would be met with vicious dogs and ominous weapons if they actually breached the enclosure of the White House at that time. So obviously the White House and the Capitol, they're two separate buildings, but I think they hold pretty similar value in US democracy. And the fact that if the Black Lives Matters protests were to have breached the White House, the fact that they Trump literally threatened them ahead of time, saying that they'd be met with weapons. Whereas we saw protesters actually break into the Capitol, and he didn't not only did he not give that same warning out, there's literally no action, and we kind of felt Trump kind of being a part of the police and kind of having his own say on what the police did during this.
Right. And what's interesting to see is when protesters in DC were right in front of the White House and were peacefully protesting, they immediately were being bombarded by cops using rubber pellets and pepper spray and stuff like that, even though they were peacefully protesting. Whereas these people in front of the Capitol building were simply able to walk right in. Um, and I think it was also really interesting to see how long it took for the National Guard and for backup to come in,
Mhm.
um, because we saw it took almost 6 hours for the National Guard to come in, and for like backup to come in here at the Capitol, which is like vastly different than when Trump like ordered backup in the like BLM protests, which like came like pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So I guess like past that, like how do you feel this type of fallout will transition into Biden's term?
I think this will be one of the more challenging starts that any president in the history of the United States has ever had, because one thing that we've seen Biden do in his speeches, especially before these riots, is that he was trying to be unifying. Even though he obviously won because of his supporters, he was trying to be more open and unifying towards all of the American people. But now he's going to have a tough time trying to find the balance between denouncing all these actions and telling them how wrong they were, while also trying to remain the president of all the people in the United States and not only that of his own supporters.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I think that Biden is going to have a really tough time initially, especially because there will definitely be riots happening around the nation on the day of his inauguration, and the kind of rhetoric that Trump has put forward um, has been really bad and damaging for our democracy. I mean, and I'll just say that kind of leads me into the next question I had, Vinay, which is like, what kind of lasting impact do you think Trump has left on the U.S., and what do you believe his legacy will be as a president?
Well, I think we all know how polarized the US has become, how divided all of our citizens are. I feel like Trump has pushed that difference between the right wing and the left wing of the United States. He's kind of pushed that difference even more. And we kind of feel like there's two separate groups of people in the United States. And that polarization, I don't think it's healthy for a country. It's obviously good to have different beliefs around the country where everyone can speak out, but to have two groups basically firmly against each other, that's kind of what Trump has done during this presidency. That's the lasting impact by the end of his presidency. So that would be tough both for Biden to manage. And I think that's what Trump is probably going to be most remembered for.
Right, definitely. I think that one of the things that we have to look at is that Trump has been impeached twice. That has never happened for any other president in US history. And like this is in one term. This isn't even throughout both of his terms. But what we see really is that Trump has been a historically bad president and he has put awful rhetoric forward. He has made people think that quote the like left is out to get them,
Mhm.
and like the left is trying to suppress the voices of the right, which inherently isn't true, but the rhetoric he's put forward has made people think that, and this has had like really bad ramifications because now what we see is that not only has our country become more divided, but now a vast like a large amount of people in the US think that their voices aren't heard and think that this election was rigged and now they don't trust our system and the democracy.
Yeah, I think that was a great point that you brought up at the end about how people don't trust the election results. And for me, that's the worst part about it, the misinformation that has gone on during this presidency, where there's facts that you get. Like, for example, right, I mean, sorry, left wing news sources will post facts at least as they see it, but all the right wing news outlets are posting completely different facts. And Trump's tweet saying, "Oh, this was a rigged election, mail-in ballots are fraudulent," all of that stuff really contributes to making our system more polarized and making it so that 50% of the people trust the system, 50% of the people don't trust the system. And even at the end of um last the last election, when we saw some people saying, "Oh, Russian hackers helped Trump win," it kind of shows that despite how much the US might try to say, "Okay, this is the best way to hold our elections," I'm not sure if there's going to be many people trusting election results whenever it goes against them.
Yeah, definitely. So, what strategies do you think that Biden could implement or use, or what do you think he's already doing that could help to, I know as cheesy as it sounds, like ensure that our democracy stands strong?
I think he's gonna have to try and find the balance between taking more severe action against protesters whenever those protests do happen, but also not being too severe in the fact that if he utilizes really, really strong force, then people will say, oh, you wouldn't do this against Black Lives Matters protesters. So there's a really fine balance that he needs to strike. It would be very tough for him to find that, but I think that he's well equipped to do that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we've already seen Biden say that like this kind of reaction would have been very different if there were if the protesters were BLM protesters. And I think that's something really interesting that he would say because I think it's one of the more polarizing, I guess, things he would say, a little bit more like radical than I would have expected him to say.
Mm-hmm.
Because like obviously a lot of people don't believe that. But it's interesting to see like how he's handling this. I think in the future, Biden is going to need to be really clear and find common ground between the two sides because he needs to reestablish that our country has a system and it's working. Our election was not rigged. And while there might have been some ballots that or some ballots that may have been miscounted or something, it doesn't change the results. And he just needs to be clear and find common ground like that.
Yeah, it'll be a very tough thing for him to do because I guess by bringing up his comments about how the reaction would have been much different if this was a Black Lives Matters protest. In a way, he's kind of working against himself because while his supporters know that and while he knows that as well, I don't think that's the best thing to do to try and unite this country. So I think in the future he's going to have to be more careful, not necessarily because it's the right thing to do, but to make sure that our democracy is still trusted. He needs to be a bit more opening towards the other side.
Definitely.
So I think now we can move on to the W segment. So our first story today is that a man who forgot his Bitcoin password finally has accepted his fate. So he many years ago bought a bunch of Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin today is now worth about $220 million worth of US dollars. However, he locked that away onto a hard drive, and that hard drive is such that it erases all its data after 10 password attempts. The only problem is that this man has actually forgotten his password. And now he's already tried to put in the correct password 8 times, but he hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. So now he's basically given up on getting the $220 million that he deserves. So how do you feel about this, Rohan?
Wow. Well, that's really sad, Vinay. We've all been in places where we've forgotten our passwords, but
Mhm.
never has that mistake been worth $220 million. So I guess my W word would be wasted because he wasted the opportunity to be a millionaire. He wasted all this money. He made the smartest investment decision to get into Bitcoin. And now that it's worth so much money, he's lost it all. It's just really sad. Wasted.
Yeah, I feel like he's probably thinking, is there not any other password that I could have forgotten instead of this one? So if you think about it, we all probably have maybe 30 or 40 passwords, and we might forget one of them, but just happens that he's forgotten the one which costs $220 million. So our next
Yeah.
story is that there's ice cream in northeastern China, and guess what tested positive for? COVID-19. So obviously, COVID has affected more than 93 million people across the globe, but now COVID has been found in ice cream. They're saying that the COVID is actually living through the fat within the ice cream. So I guess in one way, it's obviously a weird story to see, but it's also quite scary to see that COVID can be transmitted just through the fat in ice cream. So how would you rate this story, Rohan?
So the COVID was surviving in the ice cream.
Yeah,
Wow.
it was present within the ice cream's fat, and it was able to survive because of the cold storage temperature.
Wow. I'll give that a worrisome, I guess,
Hmm.
because I will say that's kind of scary to see that it can transition through foods like ice cream, which is obviously really tasty. But I will say I'm not sure if that's going to stop me from eating ice cream.
Yeah, it probably won't. This is just in northeastern China, and this ice cream, the manufacturers of this ice cream weren't the most hygienic, and they think that
Mm,
was one of the main reasons why COVID was actually found within that.
got it.
So our next story is quite an interesting one. That Atlantic City is offering bidders the chance to blow up a former Trump casino. So obviously, when Trump left, he mocked, he openly mocked Atlantic City by saying that he made a lot of money and then got out. So then now the mayor of Atlantic City is raising a charity event for this, and obviously the highest bidder, all that money will go towards charity. But it's kind of like an event almost to celebrate how Trump is finally out of office. So how would you rate this story, Rohan?
Wow. I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I think now we can see like the fallout of his presidency and like how he's like even being treated. Like people are excited to blow up this building. I'll probably give it a wobbly because I think Trump has gotten wobbly now. He's been
Mhm.
impeached twice. His neighbors in Mar-a-Lago want to get rid of him. These people want to blow up this Atlantic City building. It's wobbly, man. He's just having a hard time right now.
Mm. So now it's time for one of the most ridiculous stories I've seen. Now, this happened in May of last year, but it was such an interesting story. Two men robbed a US convenience store wearing watermelon rind as their disguises. So, I mean, that is one of the most crazy things I've ever heard, that someone is trying to hide their identity within watermelon crime. And this was obviously more at the start of COVID, but these people were actually charged with the with a felony prohibition of wearing masks because they were using it in order to conceal their identity. So how would you rate this very, very interesting and surprising story?
So you're telling me they just had like watermelons like on their head, like just straight
Exactly.
up.
And their identities couldn't be found because even when you looked at the security cameras, all you could see is a watermelon.
It's kind of like a jack-o'-lantern on their head. It's just a watermelon instead.
Exactly.
Man, that's really, really interesting, Vinay. Listen, I would say that I would give this the word watermelon, the perfect word to describe this moment. I mean, if you want a real one, I mean, I would give like wearable because I didn't know watermelons were wearable, but I think watermelon perfectly describes this.
That's one of the best W adjectives I've ever heard.
I think it's a great way to end the RV show for today, Vinay.
Thank you so much for listening. Next week, we will discuss some more things around the massively changing political landscape, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.
Thank you. What's up, everyone? Rohan here from the RV Show. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to stay updated on all of our new content. Also, if you are looking for past episodes, check out our YouTube playlist.